He didn't think he was making a mistake. That much was clear from the way he leaned back in his chair, relaxed, almost amused, when he told me what his family had decided. He was 44, VP of operations at a regional logistics company his father had built from a warehouse in rural Ohio. He dressed well. He listened when I talked. For 8 months, I thought I had found someone who understood what it meant to be careful, to be deliberate, to not rush things that deserved patience. I was 31. I worked as a hospital billing coordinator in Columbus. Not glamorous, not the kind of job people asked about at dinner parties. But I was good at it, and I was stable, and I had spent the better part of my 20s making sure that stability meant something. I want to say I didn't see it coming, but looking back, there were signs I explained away because I wanted them to mean something else. He never introduced me to his parents. I assumed it was because things were still new. He kept a second phone in his car. I saw it once when he left the center console open. He told me it was for work. I didn't push. I was 31 and I was tired of pushing, and he was kind in all the ways that mattered in the moment, so I let the quiet things stay quiet. In March, I found out I was pregnant. I sat with it for 4 days before I told him. I needed to know what I felt before I knew what he felt, because I had learned a long time ago that if you find out someone else's reaction first, you start shaping yourself around it without even realizing it. So I sat with it. I cried once for about 20 minutes. Then I stopped. I made a list. I thought about my insurance, my leave policy, my savings account. I thought about my mother, who had raised me and my brother alone after my father left when I was 9, and how she had done it without anyone handing her a roadmap. By the time I told him, I already knew what I wanted. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he needed a few days to think. I said, okay. He called me 6 days later and asked if we could meet for dinner. I thought that was a good sign. People who are about to walk away don't usually suggest dinner. I was wrong about that. We sat across from each other at a restaurant he chose, nicer than the places we usually went, which I noted but didn't say anything about. He ordered a bottle of wine. He poured a glass for himself and looked at my water and said, "Right, sorry," and set the bottle down. Then he told me his family knew. I hadn't asked him to tell them yet. We hadn't talked about telling anyone. But they knew, and they had something they wanted to offer. He slid a folded piece of paper across the table. I looked at it but didn't pick it up. "What is this?" I said. "It's a number," he said. "They want to handle this privately. Make sure you're taken care of." I unfolded the paper. $2 million. The number was written in pen, in someone else's handwriting. His father's, I assumed. It had the deliberate neatness of a man who was used to writing numbers that ended conversations. I folded it back up. "What does privately mean?" I said. He looked uncomfortable for the first time. "It means a procedure. And then this goes away. And you'd be set up financially. That's more than most people. I know what $2 million is," I said. He stopped. I set the paper next to his bread plate. "I'm not doing that." He said his family was concerned about complications. About the company, about appearances. His father had worked for 40 years to build something, and there were considerations. He used that word, considerations, that went beyond what either of us wanted individually. I listened to all of it. I let him finish. Then I picked up my water glass, took a sip, and said, "I'm going to need the name of a good family law attorney. I thought you should hear that from me before I make any calls." He stared at me. "I'm not angry," I said, which was mostly true. "But I want you to understand what I'm telling you. I am keeping this baby. I am establishing paternity through the court, and whatever support is owed under Ohio law is what I will be asking for. Not a negotiation, not a private arrangement. The law." He said his father would not be happy. I said I imagined that was true. I left before dessert. I called my mother on the drive home. She didn't say much. She's not a woman who fills silence with reassurance. She just listened, and then she said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need to find an attorney by Monday." She said, "I'll make some calls tonight. My mother had spent 22 years working as an office manager for a small civil litigation firm before she retired. She knew people. By Sunday afternoon, she had given me 3 names. I chose the one who had the most experience with high-asset paternity cases and the least patient voicemail message. In my experience, attorneys who keep their voicemails short are not people who waste time. Her name was not someone I had heard of before. She had an office on the 4th floor of a building downtown. No receptionist in the waiting room, just a tablet on a stand where you checked in. She came out herself to get me, carrying a legal pad and a paper coffee cup. And she shook my hand and said, "Tell me everything, and don't leave anything out, because the things people leave out are always the things that matter." So I told her everything. The 8 months. The second phone. The dinner. The folded paper. The number written in someone else's handwriting. She wrote without looking up. When I finished, she put the pen down and looked at me directly and said, "He's the VP of a company his father owns?" "His father is the owner and chairman, yes. And they've already approached you with a written figure." "Handwritten. On a piece of paper he brought to dinner." She nodded slowly. "You kept it?" I had. It was in my bag. I slid it across her desk. She looked at it for a moment, then looked back at me. In Ohio, child support for high-income earners is calculated differently than standard guidelines. The court looks at the actual financial circumstances of both parties. Given what you're describing, ownership stake, company valuation, executive compensation, what he owes isn't a number his family gets to decide. A judge does. I said, "That's what I thought." She said, "It's also worth noting that what they did, presenting you with a written offer to terminate a pregnancy in exchange for money, is something I'd like to have documented carefully. I'm not saying it changes the support calculation, but it speaks to the character of what we're dealing with." She filed the petition for paternity establishment the following Thursday. I was 11 weeks along when the process server delivered the documents to his office. I know because his assistant called him out of a budget meeting to receive them, and he called me 20 minutes later, not angry exactly, but with a kind of stunned flatness in his voice that I recognized as the sound of someone who had genuinely not believed I would do it. "You actually filed," he said. "I told you I was going to." A long pause. "My father is going to." "I know," I said. "That's between you and him." His father's attorney called my attorney 2 days later. They wanted to discuss a settlement. My attorney told them we were not interested in a settlement that was contingent on confidentiality, and that if they wanted to revisit the conversation after the paternity order was established, we were open to structured support discussions within the bounds of what the court would likely order. His father's attorney called back the next day and suggested my attorney was being unreasonable. My attorney sent them the photograph she had taken of the handwritten note. The calls became more professional after that. I want to be honest about what those months were like, because I think people who tell these stories sometimes skip the middle part. The middle part is not dramatic. It is not a montage. It is going to work every day with your feet swelling in shoes that fit fine 2 months ago. It is eating crackers in your car at 7 in the morning because you cannot walk into the office smelling like nausea. It is calling your insurance company 4 times to confirm the same coverage detail because you cannot afford to assume anything. It is lying awake at 2 a.m., not because you are afraid of what he will do, but because you are calculating over and over whether your savings will cover the gap before support kicks in, and whether the hospital is in network, and whether you have made the right call, knowing you have, but needing to keep checking. My brother drove up from Cincinnati twice to help me move things around the apartment. He didn't ask a lot of questions. He just moved boxes and assembled a crib that came in 14 pieces, with instructions that seemed to have been translated from another language, and when it was done, he stood back and looked at it and said, "That's pretty solid," and I laughed for the first time in weeks. The prenatal paternity test was ordered by the court. His attorney objected on procedural grounds. The court overruled it. The results came back at 16 weeks. The probability was 99.97%. His father's attorney stopped calling my attorney to suggest she was being unreasonable. I gave birth in October. A girl, 7 pounds, 4 ounces. She had his jawline, which I found quietly funny, and my mother's eyes, which I found something more than that. I was in the hospital for 2 days. He came once, on the second day, and he stood in the doorway of the room for a moment before he came in. He looked at her for a long time without saying anything. I didn't say anything either. Finally, he said, I didn't handle this well. I said, no. He asked if he could hold her. I thought about it. Then I said yes. He held her for maybe 3 minutes, very carefully, like someone who is afraid of doing it wrong. Then he handed her back and said he needed to go. His father was expecting him for dinner. I nodded and he left, and I looked down at her and she was asleep. The support order was finalized 6 weeks later. The amount was determined by the court based on his documented income, his equity stake in the company, and the standard of living the child could reasonably expect given her father's financial circumstances. It was not $2 million. It was significantly more, structured as monthly payments indexed to any future changes in his income and reviewed annually. His father's attorney filed an objection. The judge reviewed it and denied it in 11 days. I framed the denial order, not on the wall. I'm not that kind of person, but I have it in a folder in my filing cabinet, and occasionally, when I'm going through paperwork, I take it out and look at it and then I put it back. There is something people don't tell you about going through something like this. They tell you it will be hard. They tell you to stay strong, whatever that means. They tell you you're brave, which is kind, but I was never sure I felt brave. I felt like I was doing math. I felt like I was reading a contract very carefully before I signed it, or in this case, before I refused to sign it. What I learned is that power that relies on your silence is not actually as powerful as it wants you to believe. His family had money and attorneys and 40 years of building something they were afraid to see disrupted. What they didn't have was a legal argument, because there wasn't one. The law is not sentimental about wealth. It does not care what his father built or what appearances needed to be maintained. It looks at a child and asks who is responsible and in what amount, and it answers its own question. I did not go to court to punish anyone. I want to be clear about that. I went because my daughter deserved to have her existence acknowledged by every system that was designed to acknowledge it. I went because a handwritten number on a folded piece of paper was not an offer I was ever going to accept. I went because I had spent 31 years being careful and deliberate and building something stable, and I was not about to let someone else's discomfort undo that. She is 14 months old now. She pulls up on the coffee table and looks at me with an expression that I recognize as determination, because I see it in the mirror every morning. His father has not met her. That is his loss. I have made my peace with it. There is no version of this story where I spend energy on people who spent energy trying to erase her. My attorney sent me a card after the order was finalized. It said in her short, efficient handwriting, "You didn't flinch. That's the whole thing, really." I have that card too. Same filing cabinet, different folder. Some mornings I take them both out. I look at them. I put them back. Then I go make breakfast, and my daughter pulls up on the coffee table, and we start the day. I've thought a lot about why his family moved the way they did, not with cruelty exactly. That's the part that took me a while to understand. They moved with the assumption that I would do what was convenient for them. That's a different thing. Cruelty knows it's causing harm. What they did was quieter than that. They assumed I would calculate the math the same way they had, that I would look at $2 million and see safety and choose it and go away. They had probably made that calculation work before. People with that kind of money usually have. What they didn't account for was that I had already done my own math. I had been doing it for 4 days before I even told him I was pregnant. I knew what I had in savings. I knew what my leave would cover. I knew what the law said. By the time he slid that paper across the table, I wasn't making a decision. I had already made it. He was just finding out. That's the thing about preparation that nobody talks about. People call it courage when a woman doesn't flinch in a moment like that. But it isn't always courage in the way they mean it, the adrenaline kind, the heart-pounding kind. Sometimes it's just that you've already thought it through so carefully that there's nothing left to be afraid of. The decision was made in a quiet room on a Tuesday night with a notepad and a cup of tea, not at a restaurant table with a wine bottle between us. I think about what I want my daughter to understand about this when she's old enough to understand it. Not the drama of it, she doesn't need to carry that. But the principle underneath it. The idea that your choices, over time, create the conditions of your life. Not perfectly. Not without interference from other people's bad behavior. But more than most of us are taught to believe. His father made choices. He chose to build a company on the foundation of controlling outcomes. He chose to send his son to dinner with a number written in someone else's handwriting. He chose to believe that what he had built was more important than what someone else's child deserved. Every one of those choices had a consequence, and the consequence was a judge reviewing a support order and signing it in 11 days. I made choices too. I chose to sit with the information before I reacted to it. I chose an attorney based on competence, not comfort. I chose to document instead of argue. I chose to let the law be the thing that spoke, because the law doesn't need to raise its voice. None of that required me to be exceptional. I want to say that clearly. I was a billing coordinator from Columbus who was scared and tired and eating crackers in her car. What I had was information and the willingness to use it, and a mother who made some calls on a Sunday night. That's enough. It really is. Not every story that ends with someone being held accountable requires the person who held them accountable to be extraordinary. Sometimes they just need to be someone who read the paperwork and didn't flinch. My daughter pulls up on the coffee table now and looks at me like she already knows something I haven't figured out yet. I like that about her. I think she's gonna be fine.